Meditations on First Philosophy, etc., by Rene Descartes. Concerning God, that He exists. I will now shut my eyes, stop up my ears, and withdraw all my senses. I will also blot out from my thoughts all images of corporeal things, or rather, since the latter is hardly possible, I will regard these images as empty, false, and worthless. And as I converse with myself alone and look more deeply into myself, I will attempt to render myself gradually better known and more familiar to myself. I am a thing that thinks. That is to say, a thing that doubts, affirms, denies, and understands a few things, is ignorant of many things, wills, refrains from willing, and also imagines and senses. For as I observed earlier, even though these things that I sense or imagine may perhaps be nothing at all outside me, nevertheless I am certain that these modes of thinking, which are the cases of which I call sensing and imagining, insofar as they are merely modes of thinking, do exist within me. In these few words, I have reviewed everything I truly know, or at least what so far I have noticed that I know. Now I will ponder more carefully to see whether perhaps there may be other things belonging to me that up until now I have failed to notice. I am certain that I am a thinking thing.
Oh, you're in here?
But do I not therefore also know what is required for me to be certain of anything? Surely in this first instance of knowledge there is nothing but a certain clear and distinct perception of what I affirm. Yet this would hardly be enough to render me certain of the truth of a thing, if it could ever happen that something I perceived so clearly and so distinctly were false. And thus I now seem able to posit as a general rule that everything I very clearly and distinctly perceive is true. Be that as it may, I have previously admitted many things as wholly certain and evident, that nevertheless I later discovered to be doubtful. What sort of things were these? Why, the earth, the sky, the stars, and all other things I perceived by means of my senses. But what was it about these things that I clearly perceived? Surely the fact that the ideas or thoughts of these things were hovering before my mind. But even now I do not deny that these ideas are in me. Yet there was something else I used to affirm, which, owing to my habitual tendency to believe it, I used to think was something I clearly perceived, even though I actually did not perceive it at all, namely, that certain things existed outside me, things from which those ideas proceeded, and which those ideas completely resembled. But on this point I was mistaken, or rather, if my judgment was a true one, it was not the result of the force of my perception. But what about when I consider something very simple and easy in the areas of arithmetic or geometry? For example, that 2 plus 3 make 5, and the like. Did I not intuit them, at least clearly enough so as to affirm them as true? To be sure, I did decide later on I must doubt these things, but that was only because it occurred to me that some god, perhaps, could have given me a nature such that I might be deceived even about matters that seem most evident. But whenever this preconceived opinion about the supreme power of God occurs to me, I cannot help admitting that, were he to wish it, it would be easy for him to cause me to err, even in those matters that I think intuit as clearly as possible with the eyes of the mind. On the other hand, whenever I turn my attention to those very things that I think I perceive with such great clarity, I am so completely persuaded by them that I spontaneously blurt out these words: "Let anyone who can do so deceive me. So long as I think that I am something, he will never bring it about that I am nothing. Nor will he one day make it true that I never existed, for it is true now that I do exist. Nor will he even bring it about that perhaps 2 plus 3 might equal more or less than 5, or similar items in which I recognize an obvious contradiction. And certainly, because I have no reason for thinking that there is a God who is a deceiver, and of course I do not yet sufficiently know there even is a God, the basis for doubting, depending as it does merely on the above hypothesis, is very tenuous and, so to speak, metaphysical. But in order to remove even this basis of doubt, I should at the first opportunity inquire whether there is a God, and if there is, whether or not he can be a deceiver. For if I am ignorant of this, it appears I am never capable of being completely certain about anything else. However, at this stage, good order seems to demand that I first group all my thoughts into certain classes, and ask in which of them truth or falsity properly resides. Some of these thoughts are like images of things. To these alone does the word idea properly apply, as when I think of a man, or a chimera, or the sky, or an angel, or God. Again, there are other thoughts that take different forms. For example, when I will, or fear, or affirm or deny, there is always something that I grasp as the subject of my thought, yet I embrace in my thought something more than a likeness of that thing. Some of these thoughts are called volitions or effects, while others are called judgments. Now, as far as ideas are concerned, if they are considered alone and in their own right, without being referred to someone else, they cannot, properly speaking, be false. For whether it is a she-goat or a chimera that I am imagining, it is no less true that I imagine the one than the other. Moreover, we need not fear that there is falsity in the will itself, or in the effects. For although I can choose evil things, or even things that are utterly non-existent, I cannot conclude from this that it is untrue that I do choose these things. Thus, there remain only judgments in which I must take care not to be mistaken. Now, the principal and most frequent error to be found in judgments consists in the fact that I judge that the ideas which are in me are similar to or in conformity with certain things outside me. Obviously, if I were to consider these ideas merely as certain modes of my thought, and were not to refer to them to anything else, they could hardly give me any subject matter for error. Among these ideas, some appear to me to be innate, some adventitious, and some produced by me. For I understand what a thing is, what truth is, what thought is, and I appear to have derived this exclusively from my very own nature. But say I am now hearing a noise, or looking at the sun, or feeling the fire. Up until now I judged that these things proceeded from certain things outside me, and finally that sirens, hippogriffs, and the like are made by me. Or perhaps I can even think of all these ideas as being adventitious, or as being innate, or as fabrications, for I have not yet clearly ascertained their true origin. But here I must inquire particularly into those ideas that I believe to be derived from things existing outside me. Just what reason do I have for believing that these ideas resemble those things? Well, I do seem to have been so taught by nature. Moreover, I do know from experience that these ideas do not depend on my will, nor consequently upon myself, for I often notice them even against my will. Now, for example, whether or not I will it, I feel heat. It is for this reason that I believe this feeling or idea of heat comes to me from something other than myself, namely from the heat of the fire by which I am sitting. Nothing is more obvious than the judgment that this thing is sending its likeness rather than something else into me. I will now see whether these reasons are powerful enough. When I say here, I have been so taught by nature, all I have in mind is that I am driven by a spontaneous impulse to believe this, and not that some light of nature is showing me that it is true. These are two very different things. For whatever is shown me by this light of nature, for example, that from the fact that I doubt, it follows that I am, and the like, cannot in any way be doubtful. This is owing to the fact that there can be no other faculty that I can trust as much as this light, and which could teach that these things are not true. But as far as natural impulses are concerned, in the past I have often judged myself to have been driven by them to make the poorer choice when it was a question of choosing a good, and I fail to see why I should place any greater faith in them than in other matters. Again, although these ideas do not depend upon my will, it does not follow that they necessarily proceed from things existing outside me. For just as these impulses about which I spoke just now seem to be different from my will, even though they are in me, so too perhaps this is also in me some other faculty, one not yet sufficiently known to me, which produces these ideas, just as it has always seemed up to now that ideas formed in me without any help from external things when I am asleep. And finally, even if these ideas did proceed from things other than myself, it does not therefore follow that they must resemble those things. Indeed, it seems I have frequently noticed a vast difference in many respects. For example, I find myself within two distinct ideas of the sun. One idea is drawn, as it were, from the senses. Now, it is this idea which, of all those that I take to be derived from outside me, is most in need of examination. By means of this idea, the sun appears to me to be quite small. But there is another idea, one derived from astronomical reasoning. That is, it is elicited from certain notions that are innate in me, or else is fashioned by me in some other way. Through this idea, the sun is shown to be several times larger than the earth. Both ideas surely cannot resemble the same sun existing outside me, and reason convinces me that the idea that seems to have emanated from the sun itself from so close is the very one that least resembles the sun. All these points demonstrate sufficiently that up to this point it was not a well-founded judgment, but only a blind impulse that formed the basis of my belief that things existing outside me send ideas or images of themselves to me, through the sense organs or by some other means. But still, another way occurs to me for inquiring whether some of the things of which there are ideas in me do exist outside me. Insofar as these ideas are merely modes of thought, I see no inequality among them. They all seem to proceed from me in the same manner. But insofar as one idea represents one thing, and another idea another thing, it is obvious that they do differ very greatly from one another. Unquestionably, those ideas that display substances to me are something more, and, if I may say so, contain within themselves more objective reality than those which represent only modes or accidents. Again, the idea that enables me to understand a supreme deity, eternal, infinite, omniscient, omnipotent, and creator of all things other than himself, clearly has more objective reality within it than do those ideas through which finite substances are displayed. Now, it is indeed evident by the light of nature that there must be at least as much reality in the efficient and total cause as there is in the effect of that same cause. For whence, I ask, could an effect get its reality, if not from its cause? And how could the cause give that reality to the effect unless it also possessed that reality? Hence it follows that something cannot come into being out of nothing, and also that what is more perfect, that is, that contains in itself more reality, cannot come into being from what is less perfect. But this is manifestly true not merely for those effects whose reality is actual or formal, but also for ideas in which only objective reality is considered. For example, not only can a stone which did not exist previously now begin to exist unless it is produced by something in which there is, either formally or eminently, everything that is in the stone, nor heat be introduced into a subject which was not already hot, unless it is done by something that is of at least as perfect an order as heat, and the same for the rest. But it is also true that there can be in me no idea of heat, or a stone, unless it is placed in me by some cause that has at least as much reality as I conceive to be in the heat or in the stone. For although this cause conveys none of its actual form or formal reality to my idea, it should not be thought that for this reason, it should not be thought that, it should not be thought for that reason that it must be less real. Rather, the very nature of an idea is such that of itself it needs no formal reality other than what it borrows from my thought, of which it is a mode. But that a particular idea contains this as opposed to that objective reality is surely owing to some cause in which there is at least as much formal reality as there is objective reality contained in the idea. For if we assume that something is found in the idea that was not in its cause, then the idea gets that something from nothing. Yet as imperfect mode of being as this is, by which a thing exists in the intellect objectively through an idea, nevertheless it is plainly not nothing, hence it cannot get its being from nothing. Moreover, even though the reality that I am considering in my ideas is merely objective reality, I ought not on that account to suspect that there is no need for the same reality to be formally in the causes of these ideas, but that it suffices for it to be in them objectively. For just as the objective mode of being belongs to ideas by their nature, so the formal mode of being belongs to the causes of ideas, at least to the first and preeminent ones by their very nature. And although one idea can perhaps issue from another, nevertheless no infinite regress is permitted here. Eventually, some first idea must be reached whose cause is a sort of archetype that contains formally all the reality that is in the idea merely objectively. Thus, it is clear to me by the light of nature that the ideas that are in me are like images that can easily fail to match the perfection of the things from which they have been drawn, but which can contain nothing greater or more perfect. And the longer and more attentively I examine all these points, the more clearly and distinctly I know they are true. But what am I ultimately going to conclude? If the objective reality of any of my ideas is found to be so great that I am certain that the same reality was not in me, either formally or eminently, and that therefore I myself cannot be the cause of the idea, then it necessarily follows that I am not alone in the world, but that something else, which is the cause of this idea, also exists. But if no such idea is found in me, I will have no argument whatsoever to make me certain of the existence of anything other than myself, for I have conscientiously reviewed all these arguments, and so far I have been unable to find any other. Among my ideas, in addition to the one that displays me to myself, about which there can be no difficulty at this point, are others that represent God, corporeal inanimate things, angels, animals, and finally, other men like myself. As to the ideas that display other men, or animals, or angels, I easily understand that they could be fashioned from the ideas that I have of myself, of corporeal things and of God, even if no men except myself, no animals, and no angels actually exist in the world. As to the ideas of corporeal things, there is nothing in them that is so great that it seems incapable of having originated from me. For if I investigate them thoroughly and examine each one individually in the way I examined the idea of wax yesterday, I notice that there are only a very few things in them that I perceive clearly and distinctly, namely, size, or extension in length, breadth, and depth; shape, which arises from the limits of this extension; position, which various things possessing shape have in relation to one another; and motion, or alteration in position. To these can be added substance, duration, and number. But as for the remaining items, such as light and colors, sounds, odors, tastes, heat and cold, and other tactile quantities, I think of these only in a very confused and obscure manner, to the extent that I do not even know whether they are true or false, that is, whether the ideas I have of them are ideas of things or ideas of non-things. And although a short time ago I noted that falsity properly so called, or formal falsity, is to be found only in judgments, nevertheless I think there is another kind of falsity, called material falsity, which is found in ideas whenever they represent a non-thing as if it were a thing. For example, the ideas I have of heat and cold fall so far short of being clear and distinct that I cannot tell from them whether cold is merely the privation of heat, or whether heat is the privation of cold, or whether both are real qualities, or whether neither is. And because ideas only can be, as it were, of things, if it is true that cold is merely the absence of heat, then an idea that represents cold to me as something real and positive will not inappropriately be called false. The same holds for other similar ideas. Assuredly, I need not assign to these ideas an author distinct from myself, for if they were false, that is, if they were to represent non-things, I know by the light of nature that they proceed from nothing, that is, they are in me for no other reason than that something is lacking in my nature, and that my nature is not entirely perfect. If, on the other hand, these ideas are true, then because they exhibit so little reality to me that I cannot distinguish it from a non-thing, I see no reason why they cannot get their being from me. As for what is clear and distinct in the ideas of corporeal things, it appears I could have borrowed some of these from the idea of myself, namely substance, duration, number, and whatever else there may be of this type. For instance, I think that a stone is a substance, that is to say, a thing that is suitable for existing in itself. And likewise, I think that I too am a substance, despite the fact that I conceive myself to be a thinking thing and not an extended thing, whereas I conceive of a stone as an extended thing and not a thinking thing, and hence there is the greatest diversity between these two concepts. Nevertheless, they seem to agree with one another when considered under the rubric of substance. Furthermore, I perceive that I now exist and recall that I have previously existed for some time. And I have various thoughts and know how many of them are, and how many of them there are. It is in doing these things that I acquire the ideas of duration and number, which I can then apply to other things. However, none of the other components out of which the ideas of corporeal things are fashioned, namely extension, shape, position, and motion, are contained in me formally, since I am merely a thinking thing. But since these are only certain modes of a substance, whereas I am a substance, it seems possible that they are contained in me eminently. Thus there remains only the idea of a God. I must consider whether there is anything in this idea that could not have originated from me. I understand by the name God a certain substance that is infinite, independent, supremely intelligent, and supremely powerful, and that created me along with everything else that exists, if anything else exists. Indeed, all these are such that, the more carefully I focus my attention on them, the less possible it seems they could have arisen from myself alone. Thus, from what has been said, I must conclude that God necessarily exists. For although the idea of substance is in me by virtue of the fact that I am a substance, that fact is not sufficient to explain my having the idea of an infinite substance, since I am finite, unless this idea proceeded from substance which was really infinite. Nor should I think that I do not perceive the infinite by means of a true idea, but only through a negation of the finite, just as I perceive rest and darkness by means of negation of motion and light. On the contrary, I clearly understand that there is more reality in an infinite substance than there is in a finite one. Thus, the perception of the infinite is somehow prior in me to the perception of the finite. That is, my perception of God is prior to my perception of myself. For how would I understand that I doubt and that I desire, that is, that I lack something and that I am not wholly perfect, unless there were some idea in me of a more perfect being, by comparison with which I might recognize my defects? Nor can it be said that this idea of God is perhaps materially false and thus can originate from nothing, as I remarked just now about the ideas of heat and cold and the like. On the contrary, because it is the most clear and distinct, and because it contains more objective reality than any other idea, no idea is in and of itself truer and has less of a basis for being suspected of falsehood. I maintain that this idea of a being that is supremely perfect and infinite is true in the highest degree. For although I could perhaps pretend that such a being does not exist, nevertheless I cannot pretend that the idea of such a being discloses to me nothing real, as was the case with the idea of cold which I referred to earlier. It is indeed an idea that is utterly clear and distinct. For whatever I clearly and distinctly perceive to be real and true, and to involve some perfection, is wholly contained in that idea. It is no objection that I do not comprehend the infinite, or that there are countless other things in God that I can in no way either comprehend or perhaps even touch with my thought. For the nature of the infinite is such that it is not comprehended by a being such as I, who am finite. And it is sufficient that I understand this very point and judge that all those things that I clearly perceive, and that I know to contain some perfection, and perhaps even countless other things of which I am ignorant, are in God, either formally or eminently. The result is that, of all the ideas that are in me, the idea that I have of God is the most true, the most clear and distinct. But perhaps I am something greater than I myself understand. Perhaps all these perfections that I am attributing to God are somehow in me potentially, although they do not yet assert themselves and are not yet actualized. For I now observe that my knowledge is gradually being increased, and I see nothing standing in the way of its being increased more and more to infinity. Moreover, I see no reason why, with my knowledge thus increased, I could not acquire all the remaining perfections of God. And finally, if the potential for these perfections is in me already, I see no reason why this potential would not suffice to produce the idea of these perfections. Yet, none of these things could be the case. First, while it is true that my knowledge is gradually being increased, and that there are many things in me potentially that are not yet actual, nonetheless, none of these pertains to the idea of God, in which there is nothing whatever that is potential. Indeed, this gradual increase is itself a most certain proof of imperfection. Moreover, although my knowledge may always increase more and more, nevertheless I understand that this knowledge will never, by this means, be actually infinite, because it will never reach a point where it is incapable of greater increase. On the contrary, I judge God to be actually infinite, so that nothing can be added to his perfection. Finally, I perceive the objective being of an idea cannot be produced by a merely potential being, which strictly speaking is nothing, but only by an actual or formal being. Indeed, there is nothing in all these things that is not manifest by the light of nature to one who is conscientious and attentive. But when I am less attentive, and the images of sensible things blind the man's eye, I do not so easily recall why the idea of a being more perfect than me necessarily proceeds from a being that really is more perfect. This being the case, it is appropriate to ask further whether I myself who have this idea could exist, if such a being did not exist. From what source, then, do I derive my existence? Why, it must be from myself, or from my parents, or from whatever other things there are that are less perfect than God. For nothing more perfect than God, or even as perfect as God, can be thought or imagined by nature. But if I got my being from myself, I would not doubt, nor would I desire, nor would I lack anything at all, for I would have given myself all the perfections of which I have some idea. In doing so, I myself would be God. I must not think that the things I lack could perhaps be more difficult to acquire than the ones I have now. On the contrary, it is obvious that it would have been much more difficult for me, that is, a thing or a substance that thinks, to emerge out of nothing than it would be to acquire the knowledge of many things about which I am ignorant. Certainly, if I got this greater thing from myself, I would not have denied myself at least those things which can be had more easily, nor would I have denied myself any of those other things that I perceived to be contained in the idea of God, for surely none of them seemed to me more difficult than to bring about. But if any of them were more difficult to bring about, they would certainly also seem more difficult to me, even if the remaining ones that I possess I got from myself, since it would be on account of them that I would experience that my power is limited. Nor am I avoiding the force of these arguments if I suppose that perhaps I have always existed as I do now, as if it then followed that no author of my existence needs be sought. For because the entire span of one's life can be divided into countless parts, each one wholly independent of the rest, it does not follow from the fact that I existed a short time ago that I must exist now, unless some cause, as it were, creates me all over again at this moment, that is to say, which preserves me. For it is obvious to one who pays close attention to the nature of time, that plainly the same force and action are needed to preserve anything at each individual moment that it lasts as would be required to create that same thing anew, were it not yet in existence. Thus, conservation differs from creation solely by virtue of a distinction of reason. This, too, is one of those things that are manifest by the light of nature. Therefore, I must now ask myself whether I possess some power by which I can bring it about that I myself, who now exist, will also exist a little later on. For since I am nothing but a thinking thing, or at least since I am now dealing simply and precisely with that part of me which is a thinking thing, if such a power were in me, then I would certainly be aware of it. But I observe that there is no such power, and from this very fact I know most clearly that I depend upon some other being than myself to be preserved. But perhaps this being is not God, and I have been produced either by my parents or by some other causes less perfect than God. On the contrary, as I have said before, it is obvious that there must be at least as much in the cause as there is in the effect. Thus, regardless of what it is that eventually is assigned as my cause, because I am a thinking thing, and have within me a certain idea of God, it must be granted that what caused me is also a thinking thing, and it too has an idea of all the perfections which I attribute to God. And I can again inquire of this cause whether it got its existence from itself or from another cause. For if it got its existence from itself, it is evident from what has been said that it is itself God, because, having the power of existing in and of itself, it unquestionably also has the power of actually possessing all the perfections of which it has in itself an idea, that is, all the perfections that I conceive to be in God. However, if it got its existence from another cause, I will once again inquire in similar fashion about this other cause, whether it got its existence from itself or from another cause, until finally I arrive at the ultimate cause, which will always be God. For it is apparent enough that there can be no infinite regress here, especially since I am not dealing here merely with the cause that once produced me, but also and most especially with the cause that preserves me at the present time. Nor can one fancy that perhaps several partial causes have concurred in bringing me into being, and that I have taken the ideas of the various perfections I attribute to God from a variety of causes, so that all of these perfections are found somewhere in the universe, but not all joined together in a single being, God. On the contrary, the unity, the simplicity, that is, the inseparability of all those features that are in God, is one of the chief perfections that I understand to be in him. Certainly the idea of the unity of all his perfections could not have been placed in me by any cause from which I did not also get the idea of the other perfections, for neither could some cause have made me understand them joined together and inseparable from one another, unless it also caused me to recognize what they were. Finally, as to my parents, even if everything that I ever believed about them were true, still it is certainly not they who preserve me, nor is it they who in any way brought me into being, insofar as I am a thinking thing. Rather, they merely place certain dispositions in the matter which I judge to contain me, that is, a mind, which now is the only thing I take myself to be. And thus there can be no difficulty here concerning my parents. Indeed, I have no choice but to conclude that the mere fact of my existing and of there being in me an idea of a most perfect being, that is, God, demonstrates most evidently that God too exists. All that remains for me is to ask how I received this idea of God. For I did not draw it from the senses. It never came upon me unexpectedly. As is usually the case with the ideas of sensible things, when these things present themselves, or seem to present themselves, to the external sense organs. Nor was it made by me, for I plainly can neither subtract anything from it nor add anything to it. Thus the only option remaining is that this idea is innate in me, just as the idea of myself is innate in me. To be sure, it is not astonishing that in creating me, God should have endowed me with this idea, so that it would be like the mark of the craftsman impressed upon his own work, although this mark need not be something distinct from the work itself. But the mere fact that God created me makes it highly plausible that I have somehow been made in his image and likeness, and that I perceive this likeness, in which the idea of God is contained, by means of the same faculty by which I perceive myself. That is, when I turn the mind's eye toward myself, I understand not only that I am something incomplete and dependent on another, something aspiring indefinitely for greater and better things, but also that the being on whom I depend has in himself all those greater things, not merely indefinitely and potentially, but infinitely and actually, and thus that he is God. The whole force of the argument rests on the fact that I recognize it would be impossible for me to exist, being of such a nature as I am, namely having in me the idea of God, unless God did in fact exist. God, I say, that same being, the idea of whom is in me, a being having all those perfections that I cannot comprehend, but can somehow touch with my thought, and a being subject to no defects whatever. From these considerations it is quite obvious that he cannot be a deceiver, for it is manifest by the light of nature that all fraud and deception depend on some defect. But before examining this idea more closely, and at the same time inquiring into other truths that can be gathered from it, at this point I want to spend some time contemplating this God, to ponder his attributes, and, so far as the eye of my darkened mind can take me, to gaze upon, to admire, and to adore the beauty of this immense light. For just as we believe by faith that the greatest felicity of the next life consists solely in the contemplation of the divine majesty, so too we now experience that from the same contemplation, although it is much less perfect, the greatest pleasure of which we are capable in this life can be perceived. End of Meditation 3.